All right, thank you everyone for coming along. As Peter very kindly said, I'm the facilitator of the Grassy Plains Network, where I always like to start a presentation with a picture like this of some flowering meadow type of grassland. So just to dispel any notions you might have that grasslands need to be brown, snaky, sort of dangerous fire hazards. They can be these beautiful meadow-like places as well. This is annoying, but I'll get there. Of course, it's suddenly, there we go. So the Grassy Plains Network has been around a few years now, not nearly as long as Friends at Steel Creek. We were founded in 2018 and we represent a broad range of academics and land management professionals and community who are concerned about the deterioration of our grassy ecosystems, especially in Melbourne and its surrounds. And I suppose the expertise in our membership is quite broad and deep, so we're pretty proud of that. In this presentation, I'm going to show you some grasslands. I'm going to talk about how critically endangered they are. And then I'm going to talk about the three main groupings of grasslands that the Grassy Plains Network works across, and then some stuff about what we can be doing. So here's a beautiful grassland. Again, not much grass in this grassland. This is out in Warndoo Common in Melbourne's west. It's the well, Victoria's west. It's the year after a burn, so it's gone pretty gangbusters in the spring show. It's a great example of what a grassland can aspire to be, I suppose. This is another image that I'm particularly fond of. It gives that sense of great expanse, being able to be lost in the landscape. The land of sweeping plains that's so fundamental to the way we view grasslands in the Australian psyche, I suppose. This is the same sort of grassland, but I suppose a few months later at the end of summer, people would look at this and think, yes, snaky fire hazard and so on. But this is out in the Western Grassland Reserves. It's actually really this dark orange colour is kangaroo grass, which is something that we really like to see in a grassland. It's not always there, it often gets lost. And the grassland ends up being dominated by these other wallaby grasses and stipers and so on, but you can see the paler straw coloured grasses. Surprisingly, grasslands can be quite wet as well. These ephemeral wetlands are really important to grasslands. They sort of appear on suppose shallow soaks are the heavy clay soils that are the natural product of the erosion of the lava that's formed the Victorian volcanic plain, on which all our grasslands in Victoria, not all of them, but the grasslands of the Victorian volcanic plain are on the Victorian volcanic plain. These are more endangered still than our normal grasslands, just because often people don't know they're there. If it's a dry time, you'd have no idea that what's going on, but they'll have huge flocks of birds at them and so on when the time is right. And this is what grasslands often look like as well. Some peri-urban, neglected paddock with a burnt out car in it. The burn's not a bad thing, but the lack of weed control after the burn might be a serious issue. So they often tend to look neglected, and they can be sites for dumping and things like that. It's an important reality, I suppose. So less than 2% of our grasslands remain. It's an often cited figure. It's they're critically endangered federally and state-wise. To give you an idea of what 2% looks like, this is the way grasslands were before white settlement invasion. They went all the way from like the Yarra River across Melbourne's west and all the way to the South Australian border. These days, it looks more like this. So, oops, sorry, this. So just isolated fragments scattered across the landscape. And they have, you'll notice over on the right, these two large areas of remaining grassland, which are very close to that purple yellow line. That's the urban growth boundary of Melbourne. And those yellow blobs will turn into the Western Grassland Reserves, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. So here we have Melbourne. Purple line is the urban growth boundary. This colour here is the extent of the Victorian volcanic plain. Back in 2009, the government released a whole lot of land for new development, all of these red areas. That's so the urban growth boundary prior to 2009 was within, did not include those red areas. And to promote development, to ease development, the Melbourne Strategic Assessment, as it was called, aimed to assess all the biodiversity in those red areas, decide which bits could be kept, and then allow any other native vegetation to be removed. Those 43 reserves that they decided could be kept here in that sort of turquoise colour. There are a few other green patches in here that were reserved before the biodiversity conservation reserves and the Melbourne Strategic Assessment, but this is basically all this green stuff that was allowed to remain. So any local sites of significance can be removed. And as part of that deal, the fees that the developers pay for the right to remove that vegetation gets put into the Western Grassland Reserve. So those two large orange blobs we saw in the earlier slide. And so the idea is that the clearing of all of this land will fund the preservation of the grasslands in these areas. Things didn't quite go as planned though. Sorry, before that, if we just zoom into one of those grassland patches, the Western Grassland Reserves, I'd like to point out that grassland is not just grassland. In that, very little, with these red colours are what we call good quality grassland, high quality grassland. So you can see that in that whole Western Grassland Reserve area, very little is actually good quality grassland. This is okay. This is pretty rubbish through here. So the takeaway fact from that is that we might have 2% remaining, but only a very small fraction of that 2% is actually high quality grassland. The rest is really seriously degraded and often fairly species poor. So that 2% hides the fact that the situation is actually quite a bit worse. The failings of the Western Grassland Reserves are numerous, and I could talk to you for hours about that. Only 10% of the land all of it was supposed to be acquired by 2020, but only 10% has been to date. Well, it's up to 15% now. But what happened when the government declared these reserves, they put a public acquisition overlay over the whole lot. The farmers said, we're going to acquire our land. Why would we bother maintaining the weeds and that sort of thing? As a consequence, they've walked away from their care, I suppose. A lot of them would be just land bankers and so on. And the Western Grassland Reserves are now rife with weeds, and it's a major problem, and much decent grassland is being lost because of the lack of any interim management between the declaration of these reserves and the purchase of the land by the government. The other thing about these Western Grassland Reserves is that we're getting rid of quite good quality grassland in those growth corridor areas, and that's funding the purchase of not so good grassland in the Western Grassland Reserve. So that's another big problem. To their credit, they'll recognise this. The Victorian Auditors General's report in 2020 gave them a serious rap over the knuckles and a lot worse. So I think they're trying to be better. Hopefully they will be. Jury is still out. In those growth areas, we have those 43 reserves and so on, but they all suffer pretty much the same problem that a lot of the Western Grassland Reserve does. They are not yet in public ownership. They're not under appropriate management, and the quality of their grasslands is also in decline. So that's this area, the Western Grassland Reserves, and these growth areas through here. But there's also all this other area. So the part of Melbourne that's covered by the Victorian volcanic plain that was Melbourne back before 2009, before the urban growth boundary moved. And there are a lot of grasslands across that general area, several hundred. Well, I haven't counted them. This map doesn't show the smaller reserves, of which there, yes, like I say, are numerous. For want of, like, this is no definitive categorization system, but just for purpose of conversation, we have a whole lot of grasslands up the Merry Creek corridor and up other corridors too, like the Cororoit Creek and so on, and the Maribyrnong River. We have these big patches in the industrial west. So this is often like large kangaroo grass paddocks that have been left over, have not yet been developed. The industrial, I suppose, just on the industrial things, they have the advantage of you can put a big fence around them and lock them up, and no one really cares. Like, you can manage them for conservation without having to care too much about the aesthetics of that management. That's not the case in the residential context, where these grasslands have to perform a lot better. So they have to invite people in, they have to engage with them, they should be building the stakeholders of our future, that sort of thing. This one in Caroline Springs has a large lookout tower in the middle of it, so you can stand up there and look at the black tiled roofs of the houses that are now on what was grassland. Very slightly perverse. We have places like Truganina Pioneer Cemetery down here, this tiny little patch down here. These sort of cemeteries are really important for grassland conservation. They've been fenced for forever, or since, you know, settlement. They haven't been grazed. No one wants a cow grazing their aunt's grave, and they haven't had fertiliser put on them. So those three things together mean that the grassland there has been preserved very well, and Truganina is the site of Victoria's largest collection of the critically endangered and wonderfully named Buffon wrinklewort in the daisy family. And rail corridors are in a way similar to the pioneer cemeteries, in that they've been burnt regularly for biomass reduction. They haven't been grazed very much or only infrequently, and they haven't had fertiliser put on them. So some of our best grasslands are along like these sort of corridors that you can see staking across the map here. So grasslands, they come in on many land uses, I suppose, in many contexts with many authorities you have to deal with, whether it's rail authorities or cemetery authorities or waterway authorities. They offer a very complex management environment. Something that's very important to say is that small is often beautiful when it comes to grasslands. To give you an example, Evan Street grassland in the city of Hume, and Evan Street's one of the best grasslands we have, full stop. The magenta storksbill is there in the city of Hume. That's the only place you'll find it. So you pluck those plants out and it's local extinction there. And in fact, Evan Street grassland has, I think, 19 species that are only found in Evan Street grassland. within the city of Hume. And similarly in Hobson's Bay, 67 plant species have gone locally extinct. So these extinctions, we're not talking national extinctions, but they are very real and they diminish the quality of our local environments. The other really important thing to say is that we don't really know what used to be there for a lot of these things. Like I showed you that map earlier with that fragmented landscape, that 2% and so on, when there was another 98% that were there, and the grasslands differ so much from one to the other. Truganina Cemetery is full of Rutedosis. It's the lilies dominate out in Warndoo Common. It's another one will be thick with Demeter. Even a slight change of a few centimetres in a grassland, almost flat topography, can create quite a different suite of species that occupy it. So when we try and imagine what the grasslands, the vast grasslands of the Victorian volcanic plain looked like, it's like taking a finger and a knee and a kidney and trying to imagine what a human looked like. It's really, I suppose, beyond us in a way. What we want to achieve, all right, protection, obviously. There's quite a substantial portion, amount of grassland that's still in private ownership, and we'd like that moved into public ownership. We want to use all the legal mechanisms, I suppose, at our command. So environmental significance overlays are a really important one of those. If a grassland has an ESO over it and there's a development application for it, if that planning application goes to VCAT, then VCAT are pretty much obliged to give the environmental significance of that grassland greater weight. And it also means that organisations like DELP or departments like DELP have to give greater oversight to the surveys that suggest what biodiversity values are there, for instance. So an ESO triggers a whole lot of helpful additional help. The other thing we want is good management. Good management is pretty vital for grasslands. One of the things about grasslands is they need constant biomass removal. So by that I mean the bulk of biodiversity in a grassland is often between the grasses. It's not actually the grasses themselves. So between those tussocks, in the intertussock spaces, you'll find the lilies and orchids and daisies and the spider holes and the moths and everything else that makes the grassland so rich. But if the grassland doesn't have regular burning or grazing or slashing, the dead thatch of the tussocks increases and increases and increases to the point where it shades out all of those gaps and water can't get through, and many of the species that would live in those gaps can't, and the biodiversity, the ecosystem collapses pretty much. One of the most important things we want to do, anyway, that's it. So one of the most important things we want to do is provide cues to care. It was a real eye-opener for me when someone told me about this. Back in the mid-90s, an American landscape architect, Joan Nassauer, published an article called Messy Ecosystems, Orderly Frames. And her idea was that people don't particularly like messy ecosystems. We like order and tidiness and that sort of thing. If we have something like a grassland, and we then put a pretty frame around it, as it were, a nice tidy frame that shows that we are caring for this mess in the middle, people will actually say, oh, that's nice, and they will transfer those positive feelings about the frame to the contents of the frame as well. So they will learn to love the grasslands because there are all of these cues showing that the grasslands are being cared for. And this is really important. Not like you can walk into a forest and everyone can go ooh and ah at a mountain ash forest and so on, but grasslands can be a really hard ask. They can be brown and snaky and that sort of thing. They can look quite derelict, often because they have been sites of rubbish dumping and that sort of thing, or they haven't had the levels of management that they should have. And one of the, so this idea of cues to care can be really critical in the way that we approach designing the surrounds of a grassland so that it can really engage people. Restoration is vital. Often, as I've said, these have had a bit of a hard life, these grasslands. They haven't had the management they've needed. They've lost species. They're living in a harsh urban environment rather than out in the wide open grassy plains of the Victorian volcanic plain. So yes, restoring ecosystem function is very important. But one of the things too is that, remember, we don't actually know what they look like in a way. So you can, I think, take a little bit of liberty with how you restore them. You don't have to have a naturally placed assortment of plants, for instance. You can bung stuff in to make bigger, bolder statements. That's probably a little bit controversial, and I'm sure some people will disagree, and that would be excellent to have that discussion. Engagement, so fundamental. Of course, as I've said, grasslands can be a bit difficult to appreciate on occasion. So the most important thing is to get people in to see them. So I think of this like snorkeling. You're walking out in the water, it just looks like water until you put your snorkel on and you put your head under the water and look down, and suddenly, kaboom, you can see all of this stuff, the lilies and daisies and orchids and the moths and the spiders, and you can hear the grass heads rustling in the wind, and maybe you look up and you get that sense of an amazing horizon and that sort of thing. There might be old pioneer stone walls associated with it, and then you'll notice that different things are growing next to the stone wall, and so on and so on and so on. And it can be a real revelation, and it's something you've got to get your eye into and so on, and you've got to be in the grassland to really experience it. So all of the design and care for a grassland should really be about getting the passing traffic, the local people, your community into that space so that they can start to appreciate it. And that's, friends groups are so fundamentally important for that, and they're also the people that lift things up just from the standard management that Parks Victoria might apply to a grassland. They can give the special plantings, that sort of thing. And education's the other one, and I don't mean just a beautiful sign, though of course beautiful signs are an excellent way of providing cues to care and so on. But I mean, like, let's try and get grasslands embedded in the school curriculum, so that we can have, like, young people really learn these values right from the get-go, rather than being us bunch of oldies discovering it, I suppose. Well, speaking for myself. And vision is the other big thing. It's something we've really noticed at the Western Grassland Reserves, but it's a broader thing than that, is that there are so many organisations and groups of stakeholders that really want to have input into this larger idea of what the grasslands can be for Victoria, for Melbourne's West, for all of Victoria. So there's a need somehow, and it's how we achieve this is a difficult question, but there is certainly a need for some sort of larger governance body that can bring in the academic research, that can deal with the bush crews, the species-specific people, because they're like whole bunches of people out there whose livelihood is only about Pimelia spirescens or only about striped legless lizard. It's there's these communities, the locals, the councils, the Parks Victoria, the DELP, the rail authorities, all of these people have to be in one group somehow, so that we can really coordinate activities and learnings across the whole of our grassy estate and do it efficiently. Yeah, so I want to show you emu foot grassland. This is just because we should go for a walk in a grassland. This is one I only discovered a couple of lockdowns ago. It's in Altona Meadows, and it's, for me, a really nice example of what a small and active community group can really achieve. So it's not very big, it's on Skeleton Creek. It's quite rocky. There's a small path that goes across here, right at the northern end, okay? It's, this area has been extensively planted by the Friends group, and it looks really cracking. And the rest of it is can be quite hard to get across because it's quite rocky and so on, and that's more reserved for just straight biodiversity. You don't have to go bothering the whatever important creatures are in there, I suppose. Yeah, so the Friends group, working with council, has made like a beautiful job of really showy plantings along this quite short but generous winding path. The rocks are beautiful. There's great signage through it, so there's this whole signage program along the creek that I presume Hobson's Bay has contributed to. There's a lot of weed management going on. The site is quite weedy, but it's great to see all of this weed management. There's, you know, an excellent fence, this rabbit proofing. That's a really good rabbit proof fence. It's just doing an excellent job. Nice and straight and tight and unvandalized and everything. It's right next to Skeleton Creek, so it's drawing on all of these other natural values, I suppose, to help tell its story, if you like, or make you want to enjoy this place. And it's got this great signage. Hobson's Bay has this suite of signs that go across all of their grassland estate and other parklands too. And the plantings have come out towards the path along the linear path along the creek. So these rocks and plantings have come out, so it's really inviting and engaging and so on. So it's just altogether it succeeds in so many ways. It was a real pleasure to discover. So that's in Hobson's Bay. I'm going to just zoom out for a moment and let's have a look at the whole of the whole of Hobson's Bay. So this is emu foot grassland down here, number 13, this tiny little thing. What you can see really is that half of the grassland in Hobson's Bay is absolutely unprotected. It's on private land, it's zoned industrial, it's got people actively trying to develop it. It's in a perilous state. It's not being managed either, so it's like losing its biodiversity values, but they are crackingly good grassland. It's all thebida, it's got critically endangered striped legless lizards and pimelia and all sorts of stuff in there. So it's really, really good, but it's unprotected. So we've been making a bit of noise with Hobson's Bay, and we're encouraging them to get their program of environmental significance overlays into their workflow, and they are doing that, which is excellent. But it does sort of show, you know, there can be a real disjunction between the level of care at emu foot grassland level and the level of care that's going on at a city level. They're not necessarily marching in step. And that brings me to Solomon Heights. So Solomon Heights is the grassland where Grassy Plains Network is making the most noise about at the moment. It's in a way similar to the Hobson's Bay grasslands in that it's industrial. It's right there on the 50-metre down escarpment of Maribyrnong River, so it's got amazing views out to the city. It's very biodiverse. It's got growling grass frog and striped legless lizard and spiny rice flower and golden sun moth, and it's kangaroo grassland. So it's got the big five of urban grassland conservation all going on there. It's a very strange place because it used to be residential. So where it was a residential subdivision back in the 1920s. So there are actually 433 tiny lots through here that are unserviced and just empty, except for lots of lovely grassland. And there's River Valley Estate next door. So what we are trying to ask Brimbank Council to do is to really engage all the other institutional stakeholders, of which there are many. So there's DELP, this is the airport rail link coming through here. So the new bridge, that's the trestle bridge there. So the new bridge across the Maribyrnong is going to land down here, and there's going to be a big construction compound if we're not careful here, and all sorts of things like that. So there's a lot going on in this place, and we're just at the point in our campaign now where we're trying to raise awareness of the beautiful biodiversity values that are here and how we can hopefully work to preserve them. Yeah, I think next week we'll be getting these printed, or I might even get them to the printer tomorrow. But postcarding and letterboxing and posters throughout Sunshine North to try and get people engaged with all of that. There's a whole lot more information about Solomon Heights on our website. We'd like people to write, put up posters perhaps, or help us letterbox, whatever. Really, there's all sorts of stuff that could be great for people to do. But like I said, there's more information on our website. And the only other thing I was going to say was that here are some good grasslands to visit. So Evan Street, which is out in Sunbury, if you feel like stretching your 15 kilometres to get to Sunbury, it would be well worth a visit. It is by far the showiest, spectacular grassland that you'll find within the urban growth boundary. Old Truganina Cemetery is another lovely place to visit. It's got, several, well, a lot of interesting species in there, including the magnificent button wrinklewort. And that's the address of Emu Foot Grassland, just if you wanted to go down and have a look at that small bit of community care. And that's it from me, I think.